So before the break, we were talking about quality in planning, and I think that's pretty much all we need to say about planning. The main message is that don't take shortcuts at the planning stage because they come back to haunt you. Think carefully about why you've chosen a particular topic. Make sure it's an appropriate choice, and be ready to invest some work in getting your research questions right. Okay, it's time well spent at the beginning of a project. We're going to move on now to think a little bit about quality at the stage of doing the research, but just, you know, in the best traditions of EFL, let's start with a little quiz just to wake you up after lunch if you need waking up. So I'm very quickly going to read out 10 pieces of terminology, all to do with research, of course. And in your smaller group, so I guess I don't know if you do this in pairs, it's probably easier. Does pairs work for everyone? Do we have any odd? 2, 4, 6, 8. Does everyone have a partner? If you don't, you can be a 3. But pairs and 3s only. So in your pairs, your job is very quickly just to look at each other and say, yes, we know what that means, or to look at each other blankly and say, we don't know what that means, or something in between. Okay? You don't have to write. You don't have to write. Just use your short-term memory, and I will read out a piece of terminology, give you 5-10 seconds, then read out the next one. Okay, so this is going to be very, very brisk, okay? So don't get stuck on anything in particular, and I'll give you the chance to ask if you need to afterwards as well. So does everyone have a partner? Does everyone have a partner? Let's check that first. Yes? Okay, good. All right, so here we go. First one, ethics. Second one, mixed methods. Mixed methods. Mixed methods research. The third one, longitudinal research. Longitudinal research. Number 4, case study research. Case study research. Number 5, validity. And the next one, inductive data analysis. Inductive data analysis. And the next one is reliability. Reliability in research. Reliability. One more. SPSS. SPSS. It's an acronym. SPSS. Nothing to do with espresso, no. Good guess, but well, someone needs a coffee. Okay, the last two. The second last one is sampling. 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 Nothing to do with music. And the very last one, I promise you, generalizability. Generalizability. Okay, so there's a serious point and a less serious point. The serious point, the serious point is that some familiarity with these concepts may come in handy if you're becoming involved in research. Okay, whether you're reading research, I think we were doing something about the climate. I can see people starting to get cold. Has Sue was calling someone, wasn't she? Yes. Yeah. It seems a phone call needs to be made in order to adjust the temperature. Huh? Hot debate. So I can get you running around the room if you want to. Probably not after lunch. So it's useful just to be familiar with these words, even if you're not doing research, but if you're reading research, these terms tend to crop up. Sometimes unnecessarily, but they do crop up. So it's good to have a sense of what they mean. If you're writing your own work, when you're writing your own work, there can be appropriate uses for this terminology sometimes, because it is shared language amongst researchers. And you can assume very often the audience know what these mean, so they can be a quick way of saying things. The point to keep in mind, though, is that knowing these terms doesn't make anyone a better researcher. Okay? Knowing these terms and sort of, using them liberally in our papers doesn't automatically improve the quality of the work we're doing. So they can have some use, but don't think that knowing these is necessarily all that we need to know. So, are there any of those that you want to check? Inductive. Embellish it. Well, I can explain it maybe without too much embellishment. Inductive, yes, one of the questions this morning, someone asked me about, should we use inductive data analysis or deductive, which is the opposite. So we've got two approaches to data analysis here. And what's the simplest way of distinguishing? I noticed everyone nodding vigorously when I read those out, so would anyone like to give a concise?
Is inductive leading in?
Leading in what sense, though?
You have a hypothesis and you start to open-ended question and open start and then go more detail.
Not when it's not. There is something about broad to specific, but let's think about it's to do with the process of analyzing data. Alan.
Maybe you go first. You look more confident.
Kilo.
I will explain in a more funny way.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not actually sure. I would imagine from inductive, you would go from the data and draw out patterns.
Yeah. That's basically the general idea. With inductive data analysis, the categories or the themes come from the data. So you've got all your data in front of you. You haven't really got any categories defined in advance. You're not trying to put your data into predefined boxes. What you're trying to do is to define the boxes from the data. Okay? That's inductive. From data, from general, I guess, okay, from all your data down into specific categories. But sometimes in research, maybe someone's done a lot of research on a topic, and you will find in the literature ready-made categories. You may find them there already, and then the process is slightly different, that you're going to try to match your data to those categories. For example, if we say different types of questions, let's say you're doing research on the kinds of questions teachers ask. There are many classifications for questions available in the literature. Open, closed, display, referential, WH, yes, no. They're all there. I don't think you can make up any new ones because it's been so widely researched. So if you were doing research on questions, you would want to be aware of those, and then you can match your data to those categories. That's deductive. But very often when we're doing qualitative research, especially something that's more exploratory, we don't really know what to expect. Or maybe the issue hasn't been studied very much. In those cases, we sort of let the categories come out of the data. So when I was doing my earlier research on how teachers teach grammar, and why they teach in the way they do, there wasn't really anything I could use to define categories about why they teach the way they do. All of that had to be extracted from the data. Yes?
Simon, can we say inductive data analysis is more used for quantitative data?
Inductive is more used for...
Sorry.
Okay. Yes. Broadly, with qualitative research, we tend to work inductively, because the research tends to be more exploratory. With quantitative research, we tend to work more deductively. I'm saying broadly because you can always find exceptions. So again, an approach to data analysis. It's something to think about. You've collected all this data. What's your strategy going to be for analyzing? Is it going to be inductive? And it's not about which one is better, of course. It's which one is most appropriate or suitable given the kind of work you're doing and what you already know. Any others there you wanted to check on? I heard some conversations here about SPSS, having to do with Nespresso, and even George Clooney got a mention. There is another interpretation. The George Clooney fan club is here. He must have been disappointed that he got married recently. Yes. So SPSS stands for? Well, what is it, first of all? It's a program. It's a piece of software. It's a piece of software used for statistical analysis. Okay? It's the most widely used software for statistical analysis. If you're reading and someone says, or you're listening and someone says, I used SPSS to do my analysis, all that means is they use this particular piece of software to help them do their statistical calculations. Does anyone know what it stands for, the SPSS? Statistical package, yes, for the social sciences. Statistical package for the social sciences. But you don't need to know that, but it's just fun to say it. SPSS. So it's a piece of software, basically. Statistical package for the social sciences. Validity and reliability, yes, they tend to occur together, and that's going to be the focus of the next bit of work we do. But broadly, if we say, if someone says your research is not valid, do you say, thank you very much? Is it a compliment? No. So validity is a good thing to have in research. And how would we define it in simple terms or briefly? It stands up to criticism. Okay, let's push that a bit further, yes. What bits of it stand up to criticism, I guess? Alan?
It analyzes and assesses what it claims to assess.
Yes, okay, so you're all familiar with the validity of tests, of course. A valid test assesses or tests what it's supposed to test. If it's a reading test, you don't want people, listening or whatever.
If you're assessing students' reading skills, are you giving them a test for receptive skills?
Yeah, that's right. If you're assessing listening skills and they have to read, and that interferes with their results, that's not a valid test. But let's forget about testing for now. In research terms, if we say the results are not valid, or the conclusions are not valid, what's gone wrong there? What are they saying to us? What are they saying to us?
Because they are based on
Yes? Yeah, it means your conclusions are not based on the evidence you have. That's very often a problem in research. You've got evidence, and somehow the conclusions you reach, either because you're biased or because you haven't analyzed closely enough, are not supported by the evidence. I remember reading a paper once for a journal which presented two teachers. It said, teacher A teaches in this way, teacher B teaches in this way. And it was clear from the transcripts that they taught in very different ways. The conclusion that the author reached was that the teachers were very similar in many ways. I still remember that, and I just couldn't understand why. It was clear that there were significant differences in what the teachers were doing. So that conclusion isn't valid. It's not supported by the evidence that's been presented. Okay? Valid also in the sense that the conclusions we reach, or the evidence we have, actually faithfully represents what it is we're studying. So let's say I'm interested in how teachers feel about their director of studies. This is just an example I'm making up. Okay, let's say that's my research question. What are teachers' opinions about the effectiveness or professionalism or competence, yes, let's use competence, of the director of studies in their school? Let's say, just for the sake of argument. Now, and I say I'm going to do this by interviewing teachers. Okay? And of course, I tell the teachers, and your director of studies, of course, will have access to your answers. Now, what are the chances there of getting valid data? Minimal. Minimal. So I can do the interviews, and people will answer my questions, possibly at great length. But what they say, in many cases, may not reflect what they really feel. And so I'll write up my whole paper, and I'll say, overall, teachers were very, very positive about the competence of their directors of studies. And in brackets, some would say, because they wanted to keep their job. You know. And there's a big problem of validity there. In other words, the conclusions I'm reaching do not reflect the reality I'm trying to study. Okay? So validity in its most general sense is about truth. In the simplest way, it's about truth. Now, of course, there's more than one truth. But that's, in essence, what it's about. Are we reaching conclusions supported by the evidence? And is the evidence a faithful representation of what it is we're trying to study? So two potential threats to validity there, okay? And its brother or sister or close relative, reliability, also tends to occur with it. Now, what do we do with this one? If someone says to you, your instrument, your questionnaire is not reliable, for example, what does that mean?
Not reproducible.
Not?
Not reproducible.
In what sense, reproducible?
Different results.
Yes, okay. If let's take an example. An example I use very often, and we might have this on the handout somewhere. Let's say your questionnaire typically has questions about the background of the respondent, yeah, typically at the beginning. Yeah, questions about age and experience very often. Let's say the first question on the questionnaire is age. Young or old? Let's imagine that example. Someone gives you a questionnaire, and the first question is age. Choose one of these, young or old. Now, everyone's going to interpret that question in their own way. Yeah? In other words, you might have 4 people who are the same biological age, who two of them may say I'm young, and 2 of them may say I'm old. That's an example of a question that's not reliable, because different people will interpret it in different ways. Okay? So when we're designing questionnaires, and this is one of the challenges, is making sure that the questions are not open to different interpretations. If they are, people aren't answering the same question. They're all answering their interpretation of the question. So if your instrument isn't reliable, it's because it can be interpreted in different ways. Okay? What about if we say your analysis is not reliable? This is not the instrument this time. This is a different type of reliability. Your analysis is not reliable. What does that mean? Yeah, there may be reasons for it, but yes, it's not. It means it's not consistent. It means it's not consistent. Let's say I'm classifying. Okay, I've collected my data, and my data, just again for example, are in the form of, I don't know, fruit and vegetables. And I'm classifying my data into 2 categories, fruit and vegetables. So I take the first one, it's a banana. Where do I put it? Fruit. You may be aware that across cultures they have different ideas of what counts as fruit and vegetables. Okay? What's a tomato? Is it a fruit or a vegetable? What about turkey? Is tomato a fruit or a vegetable? It's a vegetable, yeah. I always think of tomato as a vegetable as well. Yeah. If my wife says go and buy some fruit, I don't think of tomatoes. Of course, biologically or whatever way we put it, maybe it belongs to the fruit family, but in terms of people's conception. So, okay, I'm analyzing banana, fruit. Tomato, okay, I'll go along with you, fruit. And then another tomato comes up, and I put it in vegetables. So, well, I can't put one tomato in fruit and another tomato in vegetables. I have to put, once I've made that decision, I have to put all my tomatoes into fruit. Otherwise, I'm not being consistent. It's the same with analyzing your data. It's the same thing. Don't worry about the fruit and vegetables. We've got categories, and we're putting our data into boxes. But once we decide what goes where, we have to do it consistently. So if someone says to you, your analysis is not reliable, it means you haven't been consistent in the way you've grouped things. Okay? Maybe a teacher says, I love grammar, and you put her in the positive box, and another teacher says, I love grammar, and you put her in the negative box for some reason. You can't do that. So again, 2 types of reliability. Reliability of your instrument, reliability of your analysis. Okay, we had ethics, which is the moral side, mixed methods. Oh yeah, mixed methods is when we combine qualitative and quantitative in one study. We can have studies which are wholly quantitative, just numerical. We can have studies which are wholly qualitative, so they have non-numerical data. And very often, quite common today, you combine the two. And I don't know if you have time to look at that cartoon, which sort of summarizes the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. I need to find one which has got a more universally meaningful sport, but for now it's baseball. So we can see the interviewer saying, last year you had 2 home runs all season, this year you had 5 in 1 month. What's the difference? And the baseball player's answer is 3. It's a nice contrast between a qualitative way of thinking. It was a qualitative question which was hoping for a qualitative answer. The interviewer wanted an explanation about what the player, and the player of course has interpreted that as a quantitative answer and given a perfectly adequate quantitative reply. Mixed methods research combines both and therefore gets the strengths of both. Okay, good. Now, going back to our handout on page 8, I'm going to skip page 7 because we've covered some of those issues now. And what we've introduced some issues related to quality in collecting and analyzing data. Clearly, if you've got problems of validity, if you've got problems of reliability, something's gone wrong with the collection of the data, with the analysis of the data, okay? And typically, these 4 terms are used to talk about quality in research. You've got validity, reliability, generalizability. We mentioned it briefly earlier. It's to what extent do your findings apply more generally? It's the broader relevance. And objectivity we talked about as well. Now what we've got there on the handout, on page 8 and 9, and sort of to the top of 10, there are 5 examples. There are 5 examples of either instruments or results. And in each case, there's something wrong. In each case, there's a problem with quality. And the problem might be to do with the design of the instrument. It might be to do with the analysis. It might be to do with the conclusions. But in each of those, there is a problem, quite a serious problem of quality. So your task is to see if you can identify those. And again, you can decide how big or large you want your groups to be. But this is the task. Go through each example, and in each case say, what is the problem? And if you want to say, what is the problem in terms of validity, reliability, show off your terminological knowledge, you can do that as well, but that's not that important. The main thing is to spot the problems, okay, in each of those examples. So I'll give you some time to do that. Okay, you may not have got to the end, but that's okay. We'll get to the end together. The key point here, the key learning issue for us here is that problems in the way we design instruments or collect data or analyze data can create serious issues in relation to validity and reliability that can undermine the whole study. Okay, can undermine the whole study. So it's really, really important for us as researchers to be alert to these kinds of dangers at the sort of planning stage and also when we're collecting and analyzing data. Let's go through these briefly and just maybe just highlight 1 or 2 issues to make these points. So in the first one, using role play, the main problem, there's more than one, the main problem is that the conclusions that are reached are not supported by evidence. Okay? Yeah, the conclusion is role plays were a success, and a success in improving speaking fluency. That was the conclusion. But it's not clear here what the evidence of that is. Is it because the students enjoyed it? I mean, as I've said to some of you, enjoyment is one thing, and improvement is another. Students enjoy lots of things. It doesn't necessarily mean it's improving their language learning. Okay? So that's the basic issue here. It's an issue of validity. The conclusions are not supported by evidence. Some of you also mentioned other problems like, well, the study was with intermediate And then he decided to use role plays with beginners. Okay, so maybe there wasn't any evidence for that. Daniel, was there something else?
The element of the researcher not taking into account other variables that might have influence.
Yes, yes.
In a way, it's the evidence in itself, if you look at it from the other point.
What do you mean?
It's saying that the evidence that works for intermediate students, it might work for beginners.
It might work, yes. It might work, but evidently isn't really enough. I mean, evidently in research should mean based on the evidence I have. It shouldn't mean evidently in the normal way that we use the word. In this case, there's no evidence. For example, to talk about improvement, we need to know where people were at the beginning. It's a basic, you cannot talk about change without two reference points. One has to be before, and one has to be after. We can't talk about improvement unless we know where people are starting from. Even if you give them, say, a fluency test at the end and they do well, all you can say is they did well. You can't say they did better, because they might have done as well or even better without the role plays.
That's what I'm talking.
And that's why some people use control groups sometimes to, to have another group to compare. So, this would be sort of thrown out in a sense as a conclusion, because it's not really based on any evidence. And it may be a case that the teacher was enthusiastic and positively disposed towards role play, and so positively disposed that they overlooked what was needed in order to reach their conclusions. Okay? And that's where, as we said earlier, being passionate about a topic is good, but not if it blinds us to other things that we need to put in place. Okay. There may be other things, but that's the key issue. It's an issue of validity there. The conclusions are not based on evidence. Now, this questionnaire for students, this is a real example, okay? An early draft of a real example. And we could spend, an hour just going through the questions, but we won't. But there's a problem of validity because many of the questions are not related to the topic. The topic is students' views about the syllabus, whether the current syllabus meets student needs. That's the topic. When you look at these questions, it's hard to see how they're connected to the topic. I like English, or anything related to English. How is that connected to the syllabus? Yeah, there are several. So that's a basic problem of validity here. It's hard to see what's going on in the researcher's mind when the topic is X and the questions are Y or Z. Okay. Then there are many questions to do with many issues to do with ambiguous questions, questions that can be interpreted in different ways. Okay. Yeah, I'm just looking for one that can be ambiguous in that sense. I don't know. The textbooks have covered all the topics I want to learn. Yeah. I hope to live in an English-speaking country someday. All right, maybe that's not ambiguous. I'll find one, don't worry.
Number 9.
Number 9. I can learn something useful from the additional materials. What does that mean? What does that? That can mean so many different things. Apart from the fact that it assumes the teacher is providing additional materials. What if they don't? There are problems with 2 questions in one. I like English, or anything related to English. There's 2 questions. What does English mean? What does anything related to English? Don't ask people questions they're not in a position to answer, like number 4. If I ask your students whether you are following the syllabus, I doubt many of them would know, because that's something for teachers. Something for teachers, isn't it? So question 4, as I've observed, the teacher teaches the lessons by following the syllabus. How would a student know? So don't ask people. So all sorts of issues here. Someone also mentioned that maybe the instructions can be a bit leading. To what extent? It should be, do you agree? There are a few typos here as well. Do you agree? If you say to what extent do you agree, maybe unintentionally you're encouraging people to agree. So there are other more neutral ways of saying that, like tick a box to give your opinion. So as I said earlier, it's very easy to do this kind of analysis with other people's instruments. But for some mysterious reasons, when we're designing our own questions, we tend to fall into the same traps. I'm just trying to raise your awareness here so that maybe that happens less often. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Please, yes, yes.
How about with these liquid type scales? Some people give 5, some 4,
Okay.
some more than that.
Okay, so this is a question about the scale that we use on a questionnaire. And you'll all be familiar with these scales that have 5 points that go from strongly agree to strongly disagree. That's the most widely used, and they're called Likert scales. Likert apparently was the surname of the American, I believe, gentleman who came up with the idea. Likert, sometimes Likert, but I think the original was Likert. And sometimes you had 5 points, which is common. Sometimes you'll see them with 7. Sometimes you'll see them with 9, maybe even with 3. And people ask, what's the best? Some people say you should have an even number, because if there's a midpoint, people tend to go for it. Some people say you shouldn't have don't know in the middle, because that forces people to take a position. So these are decisions we need to make when we're designing. My view is if don't know or unsure is a legitimate answer, it should be included. Because if it's not, you're forcing them to give an answer which doesn't reflect their opinion, which makes it not valid. So if your answer, the way you feel about a topic is unsure or neither agree nor disagree, that should be there as an option. If the kind of questions you're asking don't need that, it's not a justifiable option, don't include it. So again, it's not about whether 5 or 6 is better, it's whether, in relation to the questions you're asking, the options you're providing are sort of comprehensive. Once you get to 7 or 9, you're asking a lot of the respondent. You're asking them to make very, very fine distinctions of opinion, which I think is asking too much. So I tend not to go beyond 5.
With pictures of smiles, for example.
Pictures are useful. Yeah, you can have pictures, but again, I'd say 5. You don't want to have 10 pictures to choose 1. I mean, the only time I use 10 is, and it's not really for research. If I'm doing some kind of evaluation of a course, I might have a final question which says, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the course? And that's okay. That's okay. But typically speaking, for questionnaires, I'd stick to 4 or 5. Just because it makes things a bit harder for respondents. But that's a good example of another decision you need to make at the design stage. Okay, interview about classroom management. This time we've got the questions that were asked, and we've also got some information there about how the interviews were done. Now, if we're asking people questions, we hope that they'll give us honest answers. Honest in the sense is answers that reflect their true opinion. That's what we hope for. In the real world, we know that most people will not bare their souls to us. They always hold something back. So we're trying to minimize how much they hold back, and we're trying to avoid them telling things which are simply not true in terms of their opinion. And this has implications for the way we ask questions. This has implications for the way the interview is set up. I don't know if you've ever been interviewed by someone. You're helping someone out with their research, and then they surprise you by pulling out a voice recorder and sticking it on the table. Has anyone been subject to that? Yeah? Yeah? No forewarning. Just before the interview starts, you notice this device appears. Or even worse, you notice the researcher fumbling around in their pocket, activating their phone to record. Now, sticking a recording device in somewhere like that on the spot is a guaranteed way to put them ill at ease, in a sense. You want people to be comfortable in interviews. I always record interviews, but I don't pull out the recording device there and then. I will say to people when I'm arranging the interview that I'd like to record, and I explain why. And if they're not too keen, we can talk about it, or I can find someone else. But it's bad practice to pull it out on the spot, because people are going to be a bit nervous and maybe irritated that you weren't sort of responsible enough to ask for their permission in advance. Very few people will say no on the spot. If you pull it out and say, do you mind if I record? Very few people are going to say, actually I do, and you should have asked me in advance. Most people are too polite. They'll go along with it. But it does create a little bit of friction, which can interfere with how open they are. Okay, so we need to think about, what can we do? We do everything we can to put people at ease, to create positive rapport. Okay? That means not asking irritating questions, not asking insulting questions. I mean, one of these here is a bit insulting. Maybe, do you know anything about? And I gave some of you the example, you know, if someone interviews you and the first question is, do you know anything about communicative language teaching? You know, you won't respond positive to that kind of question. It's insensitive. So don't ask questions that irritate people, that annoy people, that upset people, that insult people. It undermines the validity of what you're doing. They won't warm to us, and they won't open up. Okay? And there are problems like that in these questions. We talked about assumptions earlier in questions, like question 3, how do you deal with a student who does not stand up? Well, who told you that my students don't stand up? They always stand up. So it's not a problem. So there's an assumption there. So you might want to ask about that first. The same with the homework question. My students always do their homework. Do you think that teachers who cannot control their classes are good professionals? And how successful are you at keeping your... So, I mean, you know, it is funny when we look at them in this way, but it's amazing how often I see questions like that no sensible person is actually going to answer honestly, because it implicates themselves. You're sort of trying to get them to say, I'm not professional. You know. Do professionals plan lessons carefully? Of course. Do you plan? Of course. You know, of course. I mean, you're not really getting valid data because the questions haven't been worded properly, okay? The interviews were not audio recorded, but the researcher made notes while the teacher spoke. So what impact does that have on validity, not recording? Has anyone tried to do an interview and to make notes? Anyone tried? I've tried and failed miserably, which is why I always record. It's very hard to have an interview, you know, a meaningful interview where you're interacting with someone and to listen to them carefully and also to make notes. I've tried, and when I look at what I've got, it's just meaningless scribbles. Okay, if you're writing things, there's a danger that anything you don't like the sound of, you forget to make a note about. Okay, and this is the bigger issue here is one of accuracy. If you don't record, you are less likely to have a complete and accurate record. And if you have a partial record, you have problems of validity, because you're not capturing the whole truth in a sense. So as far as possible, I would always recommend recording. You know, taking reasonable steps to get permission in advance, because notes can be quite incomplete. Okay, we have our friend teaching reading. This was another one of my doctoral students once, I think. What's the problem here? What's the problem? Teaching reading, number 4, sorry. Yeah, the teacher's enthusiasm is influencing, or is likely to influence, students' responses.
And we cannot conclude that it's better than the previous.
Yes, you can't. All you can say is that the students' feedback was positive. You can't say it was an effective way of teaching reading, because that wasn't measured. But even the feedback, the positive feedback, is questionable, because you can imagine, you know, if the students like a teacher, and the students see that the teacher is enthusiastic, and the teacher asks them, do you like it? You know, the students are kind, you know, they don't want to disappoint teachers very often. So they'll say, of course, we loved it. And although it's nice to hear, in validity terms, it's pretty meaningless. Okay, so we've got to watch out for that kind of situation.
Also, the interpretation is also problematic.
Yes. Yes, yes. The interpretation that reading improved there's no basis for that. It's not a valid conclusion. Yeah, yeah. Okay. The last one was these. This is an analysis, an issue of analysis. So, a group of university lecturers were interviewed about the challenges they faced in doing research. This was a study. Yeah? the interviews were analyzed, and the following 5 themes were identified from the data. So what's the problem with those themes? Lots of overlap. Yes, they're not discrete. They're not discrete. If you look at the themes, if we're doing our analysis carefully and defining our categories carefully as well, they should be discrete. They should be vegetables and fruit, very clearly distinguished. But here, multiple obstacles, for example, in conducting research seems to cover pretty much everything. Seems to cover pretty much everything, and the others are specific examples of that. So there's a problem here with the coding, with the analysis. And that suggests that the analysis hasn't been done reliably. Because it becomes difficult to know where to put things. So when you devise your categories, they need to be discrete. Otherwise, we have problems. So just 5 examples there to highlight various sorts of things that can go wrong. And these are all very serious problems, okay? Very serious problems. The least serious of them is which one? And why I say least serious, the one that can be fixed. So some of them are fatal, and some can be fixed. Which ones could be fixed? The last one. The last one can be fixed. If the problem is in your analysis, the feedback you might get is, can you redo the analysis? And that's something you can do. But if the problem is your instruments were problematic, then you can't do it again. You have to do the study again. You can't fix that through revision. If your literature review is not great, that's something you can fix. Read a bit more, write a bit more. So there are some parts you can fix, but problems with the instruments are fatal. And that's where we need to be very careful. Okay? Need to be very careful. Problems with conclusions can be fixed. Yeah, you can be asked, you've got interesting data, but your conclusions aren't really sound. Go back and have another think. You can do that. So what can we do then, given the potential for so many problems here, in terms of validity, reliability, potential for so many problems that can undermine the quality of research? What can we do? What can we do to enhance quality in collecting and analyzing data? And let's start this bit now, and then we'll perhaps continue a bit after the next break. So first thing there, I said earlier, this is on page 10, one of our, I guess, responsibilities as researchers is to be aware of many different ways of collecting data as possible. Okay? Because having that wider repertoire means we're in a better position to choose appropriately. We can choose appropriate strategies. Now, one important thing to improve quality, and we mentioned this earlier, is being self-critical, or having a critical attitude towards what we do. And that includes being aware of the limitations of what we do. Being aware and acknowledging the limitations of what we do. Sometimes there are limitations we can do nothing about. They're just part of the process. We still need to acknowledge them. And many people say to me, but hold on, if when I write my paper, I talk about my limitations, isn't that like shooting myself in the foot? That's what people say to me. They don't want to talk about limitations because it's highlighting maybe flaws. And that's not the right way to look at it. When we read papers and nothing seems problematic, everything is great, that's what is suspicious. That's what suggests the researcher isn't particularly critical. Whereas a paper which acknowledges some of the limitations in a thoughtful way, that's seen to be a strength. Whichever methods we use to collect data, they always have strengths, and we have no problems highlighting those, but they always have weaknesses, and it's important to highlight those as well. And just to illustrate this, I've written down just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different methods there. Classroom observation, focus group interview. Were you okay with focus group interview? Was that a yes or a no? Yes. Okay. Online Likert scale questionnaire. You'll be familiar with things like SurveyMonkey and similar online ways of doing questionnaires these days. Drawings, which we mentioned earlier. Experiments, where you have a control group and a a study group, and journal writing. Journal writing as a way of collecting data is an option as well. I'm just going to ask each group to focus on one of these, okay, rather than making you all do all of them. So could you do classroom observation? I just want one strength and one weakness. Can you do focus group interview? Could you do the online questionnaire, please? And can you do the drawings? Okay, so just do the one I've given you, a strength and a weakness, and you've got a minute or two to do that. Classroom observation. Focus group interview is an interview with a group of people, yeah? Okay. So shall we start? We'll start from the classroom observation. I'm just going to ask for one strength and one weakness. And the reason we're doing this is just to emphasize the point that every method has weaknesses, and ironically perhaps, one way of enhancing quality is to acknowledge weaknesses. I know it sounds ironic, but think about it. Okay, who would like to report back quickly here, please? A strength of classroom observation?
It's the fact that you're an eyewitness in the classroom and you're collecting data firsthand.
Okay, first-hand access to what people do. There's no substitute for it. If you want to understand what people do, there's no substitute for first-hand observation. If you talk to people, they can tell you what they do, but that's not the same very often. But
and there's the halo effect. Your presence is affecting the behavior of the participants.
Okay, so let's call that reactivity. Reactivity is the fact that people react to our presence as observers. Okay, that's a term you may come across, reactivity. That's a weakness because they change the way they behave. And again, this is what we call the observer's paradox. The observer's paradox is we want to observe natural behavior, but as soon as we do that, behavior is no longer natural because we've altered it. People are reacting to us. So then as a researcher, we need to say, okay, I want to do observation. What can I do to minimize reactivity? And one strategy is you visit people more than once. Visiting over time is always better because people get used to you, for example. Okay? Okay. Right, let's move on to focus group interview. Let me just take the microphone across, please. So again, just concisely, please. One strength and one weakness of interviewing people in groups. Okay? The focus group is interviewing people in groups. So strength?
Yeah, strength is in-depth data collection because one idea triggers off another one and keeps going. So it stimulates maybe interaction, which can generate maybe deeper or a wider range of opinions, yes? But?
The flip side to that is that you may not get honest opinions because opinions may differ, they may make people feel intimidated.
Yes, yes, because it's not a private context, interview context. People may not want to say things in front of others. You may get dominant members of a focus group who don't allow anyone else to disagree with them or to say anything. It's a lot more challenging for the researcher as well, because the researcher has to manage the focus group in a way that you don't have to manage, I think. Can you just pass that over, please? I can't squeeze through here. Okay. So if you're doing focus group interviews, it's important when you're writing about your study to acknowledge this, to say, I did a focus group interview for these reasons, but of course I'm aware of the others. That's all we're saying, and that increases quality. The online Likert scale questionnaire, don't forget it's online. So one strength?
The strength is that it's fast, and it's reliable in the sense that the statistics coming out of it are done automatically.
Okay, so let's say convenient rather than reliable, I'd say, yes? Yeah, so it's quick in the sense, that people can go online and click, click, click. Okay, and it very often does some basic analysis automatically for you, so that's good. But?
Well, one suggestion that came up and I think I mentioned was that some people tend to sort of click through just randomly because it's easy to just click.
Okay, so it's so easy that it doesn't really require people to think.
Maybe.
Yes, yeah, and if you're just clicking through, click, 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 then of course the answers, are not valid. And that's got issues to do with design, for example, varying the design of the questions, so it makes people read the questions more carefully. Yeah. Another limitation of online questionnaires, of course, it assumes access to the internet. And in many contexts, that's not a justifiable assumption. Okay, so yes, if people haven't got access to computers or reliable internet connections or whatever. Another thing people have told me, I've done a number of studies where I've given people the option. I say to them, here's a questionnaire, and you can do it either on SurveyMonkey, or I can send it to you as a Word attachment in a sort of a form, which they can just click on. Or if you really want a hard copy, I can make that available too. And it's interesting how preferences vary across places. I haven't seen a particular trend. There have been places where almost everyone has opted for the online. There have been other places where they preferred the Word version. And when I've tried to understand why, one thing that people don't like about online is they can't really preview the questions. They can't look forward through it like this and see maybe how long it is, how it looks, how many questions, because you can only move to the next page when you've answered. And some people don't like that. They prefer to have this and to leaf through it. Okay, so it's something to think about as well. Okay, can we pass the microphone to the front, please? And we've got drawings.
No, we said drawings pretty much because their strength is that they are internationally understood, but at the same time, its weakness is that it can easily be misinterpreted.
Okay. So you're saying drawings is universal in the sense that pictures are part of...
Yes, and if you see a picture of a car, everyone knows it's a car, regardless of...
Okay, yeah, I'd be a bit less... I mean, if I've drawn the picture, you might change your mind, you know. I mean,
no, I'm saying even as far as... I mean, you can't draw that.
I understand, yeah. So there's a sort of universality to them. I guess drawing is part of most cultures, we could say. But, as we mentioned earlier, they can be misinterpreted. If you rely just on the picture, the conclusions you reach may not be what the artist had in mind. Another weakness is that not everyone responds well to being asked to draw pictures. I mean, I'm in that category. I just can't draw. I think, it's something I can't really think creatively or imaginatively in the artistic sense. So if you ask me to draw a creative picture, I just don't know what to do. If you ask me to draw a picture which represents your views of X, I'd rather just tell you in words. And I think when you asked me for a metaphor, our colleague has said to me, can you give me a metaphor for teacher research? And I'm afraid I'm not going to answer that question because I haven't got one. It's just a bit too abstract. But I'll answer all the other questions. Yeah. So not everyone responds well. And again, it's making sure that it's an appropriate task for that particular audience. If not, it won't work well. Okay, let's do the others together. Experiments, strength. Yeah, it's empirical, but tell me a bit more. What are the strengths of experiments? Yeah, it allows you to control variables, doesn't it? It allows you to compare two groups in a slightly more controlled environment. That's the strength. If you want to prove cause and effect, A causes B, the only way to do it is an experiment. Okay? The only way to prove A causes B is an experiment, which is why they're so widely used in medicine, etc. But a weakness, if we think in terms of educational research. Yes, it may disadvantage the control group, so it may be unethical. And in real life, it's just not practical. If you're a teacher in a school, you can't create groups specifically for your research. You can't rearrange classes so that one's control, one's experimental. You can't match all the variables in the way you need to. So this is why in educational research, you hardly ever see true experiments. Okay? In education research, you hardly ever see true experiments. It's just not practical, not feasible. And finally, journal writing. Journal writing, a strength. Yeah, strength of journal writing. So collecting data by asking people to keep a journal, a reflective journal over time. Yes, it can provide a lot of depth, insight into what people are thinking, feeling. Yeah, if it works well, it can be quite powerful. But? Okay, they may include things that are not relevant, but I guess we can always ignore those. But there's, I guess, a more challenging... Yes. It is time-consuming. I assume many of you have been forced to keep journals on particular courses you've done. And that's different because you have to. But if you were given the option of keeping the journals, most people I speak to will say no. It's just too much hard work to write regularly. It's not about the value of it. It's about the effort required. I've never asked teachers to keep journals in any of the research I've done, simply because I think it's just asking too much. Too much. If I give teachers the option of talking to me for an hour or asking them to write for an hour, there's no doubt they always prefer to talk. And it's not because they like the sound of my voice. It's just because it's easier for them. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses. Do not overlook the weaknesses or limitations of the methods you use. There are always some. Okay? There are always some, and acknowledging them enhances quality. That's the point we made there.